everyone's felt it. That moment, frustration bubbling, self-doubt looming, fear conjured up by the thought of everything crumbling, because something within your team just isn't working. And everyone's seen it. Inspired confidence, infectious optimism, propelling each other to succeed. The answer to how to get there is exactly why we exist. We are Leadercast, a platform for leadership development content and a driving force progressing leaders of all levels to go beyond the frustration, the self-doubt, and the fear. Through transformative events, modern-day digital learning tools, and thought-provoking content, we empower teams across all industries by serving leaders everywhere and at all levels, so that they can thrive together and finally become the type of leaders that they've always wanted to be, a leader worth following.
We caught up with legendary South African scenario planner Clem Sunter, who shared his views on the future as the country emerges from a punishing lockdown. Clem also reminded us that some of the old issues like climate change have not gone away.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to talk about three things. Firstly, the history of scenario planning, because I do believe that one of the essential qualities of being a leader is foresight. And that involves using your imagination as much as your intellect. The second thing I'd like to talk about are some of the flags that were changing the global game prior to the pandemic. And then I'd like to talk about the coronavirus scenarios and the impact on South Africa and what we have to do to recover. The story starts in 1960. A man called Herman Kahn wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War. He was an employee of the RAND Corporation in California, which advised the US Defense Force. And essentially his book was a scenario of what would happen if there was a nuclear war between Russia and America. 2 years later, he wrote a book called Thinking the Unthinkable. And really, that is what I feel scenario planning is about, because when he wrote that book, nobody believed that Russia and America would come close to nuclear war. But 2 years later, there was the missile crisis in Cuba, when Russia was threatening to put missiles there, and they came very close to the war that Herman Kahn painted in his book. So it was a beautiful example of how scenario planning can capture a fairly extreme future. One of his students, when he set up an institute after writing the book on scenario planning, was Pierre Wack. He was a Frenchman, very bright, educated at l'École Polytechnique in France, and was the #1 student. And he wanted to look at the future, and he studied under an Indian ashram, and then he studied under Herman. And he then became head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell. And in the 1970s, he captured both oil price shocks, the one when it went to $3 to $12 at the beginning of the 70s, and in the late 70s when it went from $12 to $32 a barrel. And Shell believed in his second scenario, invested in additional oil, and made a large amount of money. And Pierre became a legend in London and came to our attention in Anglo-American. And our Belgian economist in London said that we should possibly adopt this kind of planning in our own company, as we were the largest mining company in the world at the time. So we asked Pierre to come out to talk to our executive in Johannesburg. I was the secretary at the time. And I always remember that lecture because he blew us away with his presentation, not by just what he said, but the way he looked. He had hooded eyes, he had a goatee beard. And before he started, he said, "Can I light up?" And we all thought he was going to light a Gauloise cigarette, being French, instead of which he produced 2 incense sticks, stuck them under his nostrils and said, "I can think more clearly about the future if I'm smelling incense." And wow, that is the only time I think I remember smelling incense in the Anglo executive committee room. But we hired him on the spot, and the chairman at the time, Gavin Relly, looked around the room. His eyes alighted on me and said, "Clem, would you look after this function in addition to your mining responsibilities inside Anglo?" And I joyfully accepted the job. And Pierre really did what he set out to do. We assembled an internal Anglo team. He brought along a circle of remarkable futurists that he gathered around the world during his years at Shell. And we put together a presentation in the mid-80s called The World in South Africa in the 1990s. And one of the global scenarios that we came up with was Imperial Twilight, where the Soviet Union disappeared at the end of the 1980s. And indeed it did, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. We said that the reason would be the arms race basically bankrupting the Soviet Union. They didn't have enough money to continue. But whatever the reason was, we captured that scenario. And it was important for South Africa because at the time, there was a lot of fear in South Africa that we could become another communist vassal state. And of course, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, that fear was diminished. But it was the work we did on South Africa which showed that you really can think the unthinkable, because we produced 2 scenarios for South Africa in the mid-80s. The high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And a lot of people, when I went public and did presentations around the country, said, "How can Anglo send a highly paid executive like you to spin a fairy tale? Because there is no way that the National Party will ever sit down with the ANC and negotiate a political settlement." But they did, and they did it sooner than we thought. We thought it was going to be the mid-90s, but they did it in the late 80s. And with the release of Nelson Mandela in February 1990, the process started in earnest. I had the privilege of seeing Nelson Mandela in prison the month before he was released. He wanted to talk about the future. So I went to Victor Verster outside Paarl, and in his cottage, we had a 5-hour conversation on what life could look like in the world and South Africa in the years ahead. He didn't tell me he was going to be released the following month, but presumably that was one of the reasons he wanted to consult me. So we did the job. We made South Africans imagine something that in the mid-80s was unimaginable, a settlement which led to a true democracy and us getting back into the global economy. After that, the whole technology of scenario planning fell into disuse inside Anglo, much to my disappointment. But then I read a thesis by a young woman called Chantal Ilbury in 1999. She was writing her thesis for the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town, and it was on scenario planning for small business. And she wanted to turn it into a more practical tool. So I said to Chantal, let's write a book together. It took us 5 months, and we published it in June 2001, and we called it The Mind of a Fox. And we chose that title because a Greek poet in 650 BC called Archilochus wrote the following line: "The hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things." And we felt that was a very good way to contrast forecasting with scenario planning, because forecasters bet on a single future, whereas scenario planners look at multiple futures. They look at the flags that might indicate that one or other scenario is going up, and they look at those flags on a dynamic basis every day, and they change the probabilities on the different scenarios. And what happened 2 years later was America's top futurist, Philip Tetlock, actually published a survey of 28,000 expert forecasts made in America in the previous 10 years, and showed conclusively in his own words that foxes are much more effective at capturing the future than hedgehogs. So that metaphor is a very powerful metaphor for how you handle uncertainty, how you handle opportunities that come out of the blue, but also threats. It's the best way to undergo risk management inside a business or anywhere, by having the sharp eyes of a fox and also the agility to respond when you see a particular threat in front of you. The book was a great success after a particular event. It was the #1 selling book in South Africa in 2002, and in 2003 it was #2 to Harry Potter. And what propelled it into the bestsellers was 9/11, because what we included in the book was a letter to George Bush in which we said that part of his legacy as President of the United States would be determined by the speed and quality of his response to certain extreme futures that might come his way. And we nominated as his #1 threat a massive terrorist strike on a Western city using nuclear weapons. And it happened not with nuclear weapons, but with aircraft 3 months after we published the book in New York. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world that in a formal letter, so it wasn't fiction, a formal letter to the president said this was his biggest threat. And I always remember being rung by the US State Department and asked how could 2 South Africans actually capture a future when the CIA and the FBI and all the intelligence agencies in America missed it. And I said it was very simple. We had 3 flags which indicated that this particular scenario could come into play sooner rather than later. The first flag was the growing intensity of conflict between the major religions of the world that started in the late 80s and intensified in the 90s. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist movements around the world during the 1990s. And the third flag was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa in 1998, which we thought was a prelude for something that could happen in the West. And it really verified the approach, because that's what you have to do. You have to consider the flags, you have to play different scenarios, and then as the flag goes up, you have to say this scenario is coming into play. We have been doing thousands of facilitations around the world of strategy sessions using this particular approach. In 2006, I had to go to China, and whilst there, I was asked by the Central Party School, which is the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, to go and give them a lecture on scenario planning, because they wanted a tool to road test their 5-year plans, and the school was responsible for producing the 5-year plans. So I had this marvelous session at the school with some of the top strategists in China. We not only went through the methodology, I actually said to them, why don't we look at a specific example? What's worrying you at the moment? And they said, at the moment, we're really worried that America might go into recession. And since we've got $1.5 trillion worth of US bonds, this is a principal source of worry. So we played a recession scenario in the US. And when I asked them, what is the flag that would indicate that this scenario is coming into play, they got into a huddle and came up with property values. They said, if the principal asset of an American consumer, which is their house, starts declining in value, then they will stop spending. And since consumer spending is 2/3 of the American economy, that will precipitate a decline. And so it happened. There was an index called the Case-Shiller Index, which in the last quarter of 2006 flattened out, having risen for 20 years, measures property all over America and prices of property. It fell in the first quarter of 2007, so the probability attached to this scenario went up to 50%, and then it fell for another 3 months, and the probability went up to 80%. And that was before the stock market started declining in September 2007. And of course, we then had the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. But it was just a marvelous example of how you can capture a future that is highly unlikely. And I don't know what the Chinese Communist Party did about things in China as a result of this scenario, but they certainly got it right. So what are the flags that people are talking about now that are indicating major changes in the global game? Well, the first flag, and this is in a book I wrote in 2015 called Flag Watching, is around the religious differences that still exist in the world. We now have Sunni versus Shia in the sense of Saudi Arabia as the rival to Iran. We also have, obviously, still the threat of more terrorist attacks. So that flag is still flying, although it has been overshadowed by the pandemic. The second flag is what we call the red flag. It consists of 3 countries: Russia, China, and North Korea. In the case of Russia, they annexed the Crimea a few years ago, and there are sanctions still between Europe and Russia and America and Russia. So the relationship is strained, but Russia supplies 25% of Europe's energy needs, and so you have to watch that relationship very carefully if you're a European company. And yes, I don't think there's going to be another war, nuclear war or anything like that, between Russia and the West, because the one thing that has happened is that all the leaders now talk to each other on mobile phones and other things in a way that they did not do so 50 years ago. So there's much less room for misunderstanding. The second country is China, and this is probably the most important flag to watch in terms of the future of the global economy, because the relationship between America and China has been strained for the last 5 or 6 years. They had a trade spat before the pandemic, and there's ongoing debate over things like the innovation and stuff like that, and the fact that you need an agreement on how you invent things between the 2 countries, and copyright and stuff like that. So there's a tense situation, and one has to watch this because China will probably overtake America to become the biggest economy in the world in the second half of the century, and that will be huge because the West has dominated the world for the last 300 years. The 19th century was Britain, the 20th century was America, and probably the 21st century will ultimately belong to China. So the relationship between the 2 biggest economies in the world is a flag you have to watch in terms of future scenarios. And obviously one wants to see a better relationship after this pandemic in order for the world to recover faster. The third flag is around North Korea and the fact that it owns 45 nuclear weapons, and it has the missiles to basically take out countries like Japan, South Korea. It would be enormous if North Korea went to war with any of its neighbors, and it would be a huge, huge impact on the economy of the Far East. So you have to watch it as a flag and see whether the tension is declining or the tension is growing. What hasn't happened yet is the denuclearization of North Korea, which is what the Trump administration started. So the risk is as high as ever. The third flag is a very interesting one. It's the anti-establishment flag that went up after the great financial crash. And it has to do with the fact that the super rich went back to being super rich fairly quickly after the crash of 2008. But the middle class and the poor have never really recovered because salaries and wages have never gone up that much in any year. And many people say, in real terms, the vast majority of populations in most countries are not better off than they were in 2007. And this has created a huge anger amongst those populations, which they express against the political and economic establishment. In America, it produced Trump, even though he's a billionaire, but he was on the side of the blue-collar workers, and he got elected president against all expectations. In Britain, Boris Johnson played that card supremely well with Brexit because he knew that the north of England felt very much neglected by Westminster in London. And of course, one of the reasons that he won that campaign, the Brexit campaign, and the Tories won the election was because of the additional votes that they got in the north of England. In Europe, it's produced also nationalistic and populist leaders. And one of the key issues now is trying to stop illegal immigrants getting into Europe. And so the scenario that's emerging out of this anti-establishment flag is a gilded cage scenario where the rich countries put cages over themselves in order to keep out the poor young billions on the outside of the cage, whilst the rich old millions hunker down inside their cage. And this goes completely against the globalization of the last century, when after the Second World War, the whole point of globalization was to have movement of people and goods around the world so that nobody thought they would have to go to war again. And unfortunately, this flag has set in motion a division in the world. And unfortunately, the pandemic might even worsen that division because people are worried about their supply chains and might go back to manufacturing locally. So it is a flag to watch. And interestingly, one of the most recent manifestations of that flag is the Black Lives Matter campaign around the world, which I think is probably one of the biggest things that I've seen over the last few days, and which really has created a new dynamic as a result of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. It just shows that people now are ready to face up to the establishment. So it's an incredibly important flag in terms of what it could do to change internal societies in America and Europe and Australia and elsewhere. But obviously, it's what kind of leaders might emerge out of this particular movement. So it's a flag that could be very dangerous for Donald Trump in the next presidential election. The fourth flag is around what we call the green flag, the environment. You know, despite the pandemic, we have a huge problem, which is the fact that climate change is acting much faster than what experts used to think, which was the second half of the century. Most experts now feel that we are seeing extreme weather patterns right now. And we're seeing rising sea levels, which risk coastal cities. We're seeing climate refugees from some of the smaller island groups in the ocean, the melting of the Antarctic and Greenland. And of course, because of the vast number of human beings, 7.5 billion, we're beginning to see the sixth extinction of other species in the world. And so it has become a major issue. And after the pandemic is over, I think one of the biggest drivers in terms of the new normal will be, how do we create a green economy in the world? How do we use renewable energy so that we can move away from the threat of climate change? I do quite a lot of talks at schools, and all the young pupils at those schools say to me, how can your generation mess up the planet for us? So it is a big flag which leaders around the world are going to have to cope with. The next flag is also something that has to be considered, the national debt flag, because after the 2008 financial crash, the policy of most central banks in the world was easy money. In other words, getting money out to companies and the public and trying to keep interest rates at an all-time low. And then, of course, we've now had the pandemic, where all those relief measures of 2008 have been repeated again, but much bigger magnitude. It's something like $8 trillion has been made available in the world. And I mean, to put that in perspective, GDP in the world is 80 to 85 trillion. So we're talking about 10% of the world's GDP has been put out there in the public domain. And one doesn't know whether this could lead to hyperinflation. You don't know whether this could lead to some governments going bust because their national debt is more than 100% of GDP. There are just so many things that can happen as the recovery takes place out of the pandemic because of all this money around the world. Which brings me to the final flag that I had in flag watching, which was the pandemic flag. I basically said that every century seems to have a pandemic. I quoted the pandemic back in the 1300s, the Black Death, which killed 25% of the European population. The Great Plague of 1665 in London killed 25% of London and was finished by the Great Fire of 1666. And then we had last century the Spanish flu, which killed 50 to 100 million people around the world 100 years ago. And here, this century, we've already had one pandemic, which is the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which has killed 39 million people, and 35 million people are living with HIV. And thankfully, we now have the drugs to turn it into something that people can live with. So pandemics come. And yeah, we said, I said in the book that if you have the level of international travel we have, the mega cities we have in the world, and now this thing of viruses hopping from animals to human beings, there's everything to say that we could have another major pandemic, like SARS and like MERS, which we had in 2009 and a couple of years later. So it was a future one could capture using this methodology. But of course, the one thing that I didn't see was the lockdown and the fact that suddenly markets could disappear all over the world, cities would be deserted, sporting events would be cancelled. I mean, never, I think, in human history have we seen such a collective lockdown as we've seen over the last few months. And that has led me to write two articles for News 24, which have 4 possible coronavirus scenarios. The first one is Much Ado About Nothing, where certainly at the beginning of March, when I wrote the first article, there were lots of medical experts on CNN and other cable channels saying this is going to be like ordinary flu. It's going to pass like MERS and SARS, so don't worry about it. Well, I personally believe that that scenario can now be dispensed with, because it has been a huge deal, this, particularly in terms of the medical staff handling this problem around the world. Because the chaos in New York, I mean, New York and London, in the hospitals, because of lack of protective equipment. It means that defense is not just about defending yourself against a human enemy. It's about defense against something you can't see, the virus, which means that you've got to always have enough protective equipment, enough ventilators, enough ICU beds, in case there is a pandemic. So it has changed, I think, the game forever, and therefore it's not much ado about nothing. The second scenario is called the camel's straw, where the pandemic doesn't have to kill 50 to 100 million people. It doesn't even have to kill what the Hong Kong flu did in 1968-69, when it killed 1 million people. Right now, we're getting close to 500,000 people. But the point was that before the pandemic, the global economy was already fragile for all the flags that I've been talking about. And it didn't require a huge pandemic for the camel's back to break. And so it's called the camel's straw scenario, because this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And we have a long U to look forward to, because we've got all this debt that has to be paid off. Businesses have to recover, but a lot of businesses have already gone out of business. And yes, the markets are saying it's not going to be like that. It's going to be a V. It's not going to be a long U, because all the markets in the world fell in March, but they're up in April, they're up in May. And given the sort of unemployment numbers suddenly going down in the US a few days ago, there's a lot of people who buy into the idea that this pandemic is gone. It's all about recovery now. But I think one has to consider this camel straw scenario because we haven't had a depression since the 1930s, so we don't know what it's like. And it is just possible it's going to be much harder to recover than people think, particularly because of all the debt in nations, in companies, even individual debt that has to be paid off at some stage. The third scenario is Spain again, where we have a second wave of the virus because it's seasonal and it comes back in Europe, it comes back in America, or maybe it comes back before then, because with the easing of the lockdown restrictions, it is possible that people can get infected again. And at the moment, I'm giving that a fairly low probability because the flags are good. If you look at global infections, they're still very high, but the global death rate per day is coming down. And so it is possible that we have peaked in terms of global deaths, and we could go down, in which case Spain again will not occur. The last scenario is the positive scenario. I call it tightrope, which is what most governments in the world are doing. They're easing the restrictions and they're walking the tightrope between, on the one hand, a fall into the camel's straw scenario of a long depression. On the other side is Spain again. So they're walking down this tightrope, balancing lives against livelihoods. And of course, the other side will be reached if and when a vaccine is available. And most people think that that will be between 12 and 18 months, that it will be universally available in billions of doses. Some people say at the end of this year, but that will be pretty miraculous. So it's a positive scenario. It's where governments actually manage to walk the tightrope across the chasm, get to the other side, and we really get back to the global economy in earnest. What about South Africa in light of these global flags and scenarios? Well, I really did support Cyril and the government in locking this place down as early as they did for the first 3 weeks and then extending it by 2 weeks. I think that was a very good thing to do. But we are opening up before we've reached the peak of the pandemic in South Africa. So one has to watch very carefully over the next month or two whether we're going to see a major spike in new cases and obviously tragically in deaths. We'll just have to wait and see. But certainly that lockdown meant that we could prepare better for the pandemic. But if we're going to recover, because we've had the same thing of an economy where we've had empty streets in Johannesburg and Cape Town and Durban and other cities, we're going to have a completely new economic model. I personally believe that we need an economic CODESA to discuss that model, not a small group of CEOs with the president, but something that's bottom up, because the kind of revolution I'm talking about is an entrepreneurial revolution where we create millions of jobs by creating millions of new businesses. And we really make a real attempt to join the informal sector with the formal sector. I call it the dual logic economy, where big business and small business work in tandem with each other. And what the government has to do is provide the platform in the form of infrastructure in this country, in terms of education, health, and law and order. So government plays an incredibly important role. But the biggest thing about the new model is that it is a bottom-up model, not a top-down model, because it's about freeing the entrepreneurial spirit in South Africa. It's why America will probably recover quicker than Europe, is because Americans are basically entrepreneurial. And you can already see that they're all going back to work, they're getting their businesses going again. And my bet is that America will recover faster than other countries in the West. So we've now got to seriously look at this particular model. And yes, you still want the pockets of excellence. You still want the big companies that are world-class. And we've got plenty of companies here that are world-class. But major job generation is going to be with small businesses trading with each other in communities and in metropolitan areas. And that's where it's all got to start. You've got to have committees in those areas, and they feed into the province, and the province feeds into the government. It's got to be done that particular way. So, you know, that's what leadership is about, is capturing the idea that the world of work has changed. That it's not like the last century when you just waved your CV and some big company with 10s or 15,000 people offered you a job. I mean, I remember when I was involved in the gold mining industry in the last century, we had 500,000 people working in the gold mining industry. It's never going to be like that again. And so, given that flags are there to show you how to have foresight and come up with a model that could work in the future, we really do need that economic CODESA. So I hope I've given you a feel for what foresight is about. I hope I've given you a feel for where we are in terms of the coronavirus epidemic, some flags to watch after the epidemic is over, and hopefully a solution for the recovery of this country. And I'd like to end with a benediction. May the fox be with you.